All right, well, as you guys know, we have been going through Genesis starting really in right at the beginning, trying to build a whole Bible biblical theology, going book by book in order to do that. So the goal is to get through every book of the Bible. Today we're going to start with a little bigger sweeps, I hope. The idea, my hope is to finish Genesis in 3 weeks. So today, and then 2 more Fridays, I'm hoping I can finish the book of Genesis. You'll say, well, you're going to take on way bigger chunks of Genesis than you've taken on yet. And that's right. And part of the reason we were going slow through this, especially the beginning part of Genesis, is just laying a lot of foundation for the rest of the biblical story. But you guys remember what I said at the beginning is kind of the phrase we'll use as we're going through our biblical theology is kind of the way we're seeing the story. I ripped it off basically from Graham Goldsworthy or Vaughan Roberts. Anybody remember what it was? This is the Bible story is summed up this way. Anybody remember?
God's people.
Thank you. Joel's probably remembered because he read the book, not because he listened to any of the lectures I gave. But God's people in God's place,
under His rule and blessing.
Under God's rule and blessing. You guys remember that? So God's people in God's place. So you're talking about God's people, seed in God's place, land, under God's rule and blessing. I don't have that up there. But if we talk about the way God comes and makes a promise to Abraham, what's the promise He makes to him? You remember? What are the 3 major components of it?
Land, seed, and blessing.
Land, seed, and blessing. Okay? I'm going to give you this land, I'm going to give you this seed, and I'm going to bless you. But who's going to be blessed through Abraham's land and seed? The whole world, all the nations. In fact, in Genesis 12:3, we're told all the families of the earth. Right? Effectively reversing the curse. If you remember, God creates man in His place, as His people, under His rule and blessing. After He creates man, what does He say? And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. He gives man dominion over the earth, and man is a priest king, right at the beginning. He's working the ground and keeping it. The words for priestly service throughout the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Old Testament, are applied to Adam in Genesis 2. So he's working and guarding it, and he's spreading the image-bearing of God across the earth, the glory of God across the earth, as he has dominion over the earth. And so this is where we see him as this priest king in God's place, under God's rule and blessing. And then the fall kills that, right? The fall into sin makes him no longer God's people, no longer in God's place. He's kicked out of the garden, no longer under God's rule and blessing, but under the curse. And we see that develop in Genesis really 3 through 11. And then in Genesis 12, God comes in and makes this promise to Abram. He says to him, I'm going to bless you. 5 times he talks about the blessing. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make you a blessing. I'm going to give you seed. I'm going to give you land. And I'm going to make you the blessing. Through that seed and land, you're going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. You guys follow? And so what we've been doing is, I said we've been tracing that story of land and seed, really, as Abraham becomes a blessing to all nations. We've been tracing that story of land and seed through Genesis. And I told you Genesis really, if you will, Genesis 12 through 15 really focuses on land, and 15 culminating in that covenantal promise. Now, that doesn't mean the seed's not there. The seed is definitely there, but the heavier focus is on land. And then in Genesis 16, really through 22, you really have the focus on seed. And this ends with the covenant promise too. That doesn't, again, mean that the land is not there. The land is there, but the emphasis is seed. Here, the emphasis is on Abram getting to Canaan, or this land. Here, the emphasis is on Abram having Isaac. You guys follow? So I'm just talking about emphasis. All right, so, with that said, I had said that God made this covenant with Abram in Genesis 15. And it's this unilateral, inviolable covenant that God has made with Abram. And if the covenant's broken, who gets torn to pieces? You guys remember? God, yeah. Okay. God gets torn to pieces, the covenant's broken. In other words, it's unbreakable. It's inviolable. It's unilateral in the sense that God has made it with Abram. He didn't ask him permission. Would you like a covenant? They didn't negotiate the terms, just made a covenant with him. And Abram receives it. Now, there's two parties to the covenant, but it's just graciously received. In Genesis 17, that covenant is given a sign. It's attached to it. Abram's name is changed to Abraham, which means father of many nations, right? And then there's a sign attached to that covenant, and the sign is the sign of, remember? Circumcision, right? Which is supposed to point to circumcision of the heart, or what we might call regeneration. So just that's what the sign points to. So just to remind you of how this covenant works. So that's where we left off. We left off at the point at which God makes or gives this covenant sign to Abraham, the sign of circumcision. And what's he supposed to do? Who's he supposed to circumcise? Not just himself, but who else?
Everyone in his house.
Everyone in his household. And from here forward, every male child on the 8th day, right? He's supposed to circumcise them. So that's part of this sign of the covenant. Now, how many infant children does Abraham have at the point at which he's given the covenant of circumcision, or the sign of the covenant of circumcision? How many male children, infants, does he have? Infants. Yeah, Ishmael's probably a teenager by this time. So, how many male infants does he have? Zero. Okay, zero. It's not a trick. It's a trick question. Okay, he has none. And I'm making that point on purpose. He's told to circumcise his infant son on the 8th day. And how many infant sons does he have? None. His wife is still barren. They still have not had any children. He's getting older. You guys follow the interesting command he's given there? Circumcise your infant son on the 8th day. How many infant sons does he have? Zero. Right now he does circumcise Ishmael, though Ishmael's older. All right, so let's pick up back in Genesis 17 where we were, and we're going to come back to this promise that God has made of a son through Sarah. This promise gets renewed here. So Genesis 17, and we're going to start in verse 15. And I just want to see, really, the Lord making this audacious promise of a son through Sarah. Through Sarah, his wife. At verse 15, Genesis 17:15. And God said to Abraham, "As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name." Both mean princess, but there's a little variation on them. "I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said to himself, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" Okay, so, Abraham's laughing. Why is he laughing at this point?
He's 100 years old.
I'm 100 years old. My wife is, how does it say it she is? 90 years old. She's been barren. He's laughing. Is his laugh like, is he laughing at God at this point? Or is he embracing it in faith and laughing along with the Lord? Yeah, this is going to be hilarious when we have these kids at this age. What's happening here?
He's kind of mocking him, right?
Yeah, he's sort of mocking God. He's basically, and by the way, I told you guys this laughter theme is going to pick up through the next several chapters, where God ends up with the last laugh. You'll hear this phrase. It's audacious. That's a crazy promise. So Abraham, as Abraham always does, gets right to the business of offering a fleshly alternative. Remember, from the beginning, God has made this promise, and what does Abraham keep trying to do? I'll fulfill it. Hey, take a member of my household as my heir. I'll go have a child with Hagar. You guys remember? Abraham's always trying to put forward a fleshly alternative And he does so again. Look at verse 17. He laughs, and then verse 18. And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." What's he saying? Take my fleshly alternative. Right? This is a joke. I'm not going to have a son through Sarah. Let Ishmael be the heir. Okay? And God said, verse 19, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac." And what does his name mean? Laughter. So this is kind of this, who's laughing when you have his name Isaac, you name him Isaac? Who's laughing at this point? God is laughing.
Every time they call their son, God laughs.
Every time they name their son. Now I want you to hear what God's doing there. You're laughing at my promise. When you have a son, you're going to name him Isaac. Right? You're going to name him Laughter. Because you're going to be reminded that I'm the one who laughs. I have a laugh last. So, last laugh. If you go to Psalm 2, we get this kind of language again. What is God in the heavens doing at the kings of the earth who are setting themselves up against him? What's that? He's laughing. He's mocking them. Right? You think you're going to set yourself up against me? All right, so verse 20. Was I verse 20? No, I was still in verse 19, right? I will establish, last part of verse 19, I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I'll make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. How long has Abraham been waiting for this promised son through Sarah? At this point. Anybody remember? Minimum of 25 years, 24, 25 years. Okay? Since God first made the covenant with him, and so he's 24, 25 years out. Minimum. No son. Okay? But now he's finally told it's going to happen next year. This time next year, you're going to have a son. You're going to name him Isaac. When he finished talking with him, God went up from Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born in his house were bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house. And he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Sounds awful. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. All right, so God has the last laugh. He provides a name for Abraham's son that ensures that he'll never forget. Abraham will never forget the promise, the outrageous promise, really, that God made, and then God kept. All right, so then we come to this weird scene. So God's come back and said, you're going to have this son. All the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through him. What's interesting is that we have this weird scene that comes in next. Genesis 18. Really, all of Genesis 18. You have these three visitors, and then you have this scene of Sodom and Gomorrah. So what's happening there? And I just want to walk through it because it's an important passage. Verse 1, as we see these three visitors come and appear and confirm the promise. Look at verse 1. And the Lord appeared to him, that's Abram, by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. Okay, that's odd right to begin with, right? Okay, you're there, and then all of a sudden you look up, and there's 3 men standing before you. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Why is this strange? Anybody notice anything strange here about the grammar of this text?
3 men in the singular, Lord.
Yeah, you got 3 men But he addresses all three as a singular, O Lord. Right? And then it switches again. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. So now he goes to the plural. So what is it, Abraham? Right? While I bring a morsel of bread that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, notice the text, they said, do as you have said. And Abraham went quickly to the tent to Sarah and said, quick, 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it, and make cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she's in the tent. The Lord said, now why is that strange again? What's that? Singular. So he bows down, O Lord, and then, by the way, this isn't just some random name like Adonai for Lord, which could be used of God, Adonai, or it could be used of some Lord of an area, like a king. Okay, but this word now is the Lord said. What word is it?
Yahweh.
Yeah, it's Yahweh. How do you know that? Because it's all caps. This is the covenant name of God. Yahweh said, the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. Now, you remember that God had just said that to Abraham in Genesis 17, right? Now that's being said by who? Who's now the Lord saying that? What's that?
One of these guys.
Yeah, these 3 men.
Yeah.
One of the 3, all 3, right, are now the Lord saying this. And your wife's going to have a son. Here's one of the questions. So what's going on? How do you have 3 men appearing and they're addressed as Lord, but then they're sort of addressed in the plural, and then when they start to speak, it's singular Yahweh, covenant name for God, speaking, and they're reaffirming the promise. What's happening? Is this an appearance of God? It appears to be. Okay. Circumstantial. This has to be an appearance of God, right? So is God all 3 men, or just one of the 3?
Yes.
Yeah, we don't know. So here's what I can tell you. We don't know. So if you don't know, that's okay, because nobody else knows either. Scholars don't know. Nobody really knows. Okay? You just have to just deal with that. Just choke it down. You can't know everything. I know we live in an age of postmodern skepticism in which we require that we are able to answer all questions, or we can't believe it. But we don't know. So here's what I would submit to you. It may be that all 3 are the Lord. It may be that one of the 3 are the appearance of the Lord. If all 3 are the appearance of the Lord, some people say this is an early picture of Trinitarianism. I don't know. Okay, so I'm sure there are lots of theories out there. At the end of the day, no one quite knows. But we know this is.
Abraham seems to know and not be confused.
Abram's not confused, and that's what seems to matter here. Abraham has no confusion whatsoever. Right? The Lord has appeared to him. The Lord is commanding him. Right? And is telling him something. Now, what's funny is Sarah's listening in. So look, Abraham has laughed in the previous scene when the Lord told her told him he's going to have a son through Sarah. Now Sarah's listening in. So if we look there at chapter 18 and verse 10, The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. What does that mean? What's she in? She's postmenopausal. She's in the period of life after menopause, which means what? No more babies. Okay? She was barren prior to menopause. Now she's postmenopausal. So not only is she barren, but also she's no longer capable of having children or conceiving in a natural way. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. That's not an incidental note from the narrator, is it? What's Moses telling you there?
Miracle.
This is going to have to be a miracle. This is not going to happen naturally. So, verse 12, Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I am worn out and my Lord is, that's speaking of Abraham, is old, shall I have pleasure? The Lord said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And by the way, what's the intended answer to that question? You guys have heard of rhetorical questions, right? You guys are familiar with them? Okay, you throw out a rhetorical question. Sometimes people don't get it's a rhetorical question. But this is a rhetorical question. Is anything too hard for the Lord? No. Right? Nothing is. And at the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, no, but you did laugh. So the Lord appears as these three men. One of the three or all three. It could be that there are two angels with the appearance of the Lord. It could be because of the next scene that could be the case, or all three could somehow be representing them. Whatever's happening here, Abraham understands the Lord has appeared to him, the covenant God Yahweh, and he's reaffirmed the promise he just made in the previous chapter, right? And he said, you're going to have this child. This time, though, instead of Abraham hearing it and laughing, Sarah's hearing it and laughing. Right? Because last scene, Abraham heard it and laughed. God said, you'll name him Isaac. And this scene now, Sarah's hearing it and laughing. And we're hearing the repeating of this laughter, aren't we? Because they're just basically saying, it's too hard for the Lord. That's why they're laughing. It's too hard for the Lord. And that's why his, rhetorical question, is anything too hard for the Lord? But they're laughing because they essentially believe it is too hard for him. That's why he says, bless my son Ishmael instead. All right. Then Sarah's lying about her laughing. This is, by the way, the story of incredibly godly, faithful people over and over, isn't it? Whom God is covenanting with because of their amazing trust and obedience. Is that the story you're reading? Okay. All right. So it's a rhetorical question. It's a rhetorical question. All right. You guys, if you think that the Bible's a story of heroic characters who we're supposed to just follow the pattern of, we can learn from them, but if that's what you think it exclusively is, go read it. That is a clue to me that you have not read it. Right? If you read it, you will not find that. You will find that it is a story of a God who is incredibly gracious to an entirely untrusting and wicked people. All right, verse 16. Then the men set out from there, so these three men leave, and they looked down towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. By the way, this phrase here, when God's saying, I'm going to do something to Sodom, shall I hide it from Abraham, so shall he be a mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed through him. This is picked up by Paul in Galatians 3, which we'll come to later in this session. It's picked up by Paul in Galatians 3, though. He quotes Genesis 12:3 in Galatians 3. The gospel was preached beforehand to Abraham. In him shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. But what's interesting is Paul conflates Genesis 18:18 and Genesis 12:3 together. If you remember in Genesis 12:3, and you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now here, the emphasis in Genesis 18:18 is not families, but all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Right? Paul conflates Genesis 12:3 and Genesis 18:18 together and says that God promised the gospel or preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham. What's interesting here is, why does he say, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? What's his explanation for why he should tell Abraham what he's about to do with Sodom? What's his explanation? Verse 18. God says, I'm going to tell you about what I'm about to do to Sodom because why?
Because he's going to become a great nation. He should be blessed.
And he's going to do what? He's going to bless what? All the nations of the earth. Okay, I want to stop and consider that for a second. What's Sodom? Is that the same nation that Abraham's family's in? I don't mean located physically. Lot is obviously there, but is Sodom the same nation as Israel? No, it's a different nation. Why does God believe that he should tell Abraham his business with a foreign nation?
So is he inviting him to intercede for them?
Yeah, there's an interesting invitation, isn't there? You're going to be the one who blesses many nations. So let me tell you what's happening with the foreign nation. Okay? Whom you're going to be responsible for. So, let's look. Verse 19. For I have chosen him, speaking of Abraham, that he may command his children, his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he's promised him. Then the Lord said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. So this theophany of the Lord, I'm going to go and destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, these foreign nations. But I've chosen to make you great and a blessing to all nations, so I'm telling you about it. Okay? Interesting scene. And what's more fascinating is what's going to come next. But what I want to drive at here is the Lord emphasizes that Abraham's offspring will himself be a nation who will lead all other nations in the Lord's way of truth and righteousness. You hear that? His offspring will himself be a nation who will lead all other nations in the Lord's way of truth and righteousness. Now, I emphasize that because who eventually becomes Abraham's nation? Jesus. Good. It's just like Sunday school, right? Always the right answer. Jesus becomes Abraham's nation. The nation of Israel is reconstituted in Christ. He is the true Israel. And he leads all other nations in the Lord's way of truth and righteousness. And you see the seeds of that story happening here. And then we get this interesting scene where, following the promise that Abraham's seed will lead all nations, that he's the father of many nations, Abraham, remember, he's called the father of many nations as well. You guys remember that? Abraham sees his role, interestingly, as interceding on behalf of all nations. So look at verse 22. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Interesting, isn't it? So the three men leave, and now he's still standing before the Lord. If you want to unwind the theology of this and write a book on it, go ahead. We'll all read about your new understanding of the theophany. That it's just, yeah. Anyway, then Abraham drew near and said, will you indeed? Now he's drawing near to who? The Lord. And look at his question. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just? Now, What's Abraham appealing to? God's justice. He knows who the Lord is, and he knows he's just, so he appeals to his justice. Okay? Is Abraham questioning whether God is just? No, in fact, his prayer is based on the fact that he knows God is just. Okay? And so he's appealing to his justice. What's fascinating about this, though? Abraham is doing what? In the whole scene. What'd you say?
Priest.
He's being a priest. He's interceding on behalf of a foreign nation. At two foreign nations. Enemy nations, by the way. He's interceding on their behalf as the father of many nations. As the one who will be, his seed will be a blessing to all nations. He comes in and finds out that judgment is coming for them. And what does he want to do?
Spare the righteous.
He wants to spare the righteous. He wants to see them saved. You guys hear that? This is fascinating because it becomes somewhat, lays the early story. What is Abraham? This is why when you get lost in this question about Israel and what's God's plan on earth with Israel, and you forget what God's plan was with Israel, Abraham is Israel at this point. And what's God's plan with Israel here? With Abraham? What? Here's this king priest or priest king who's doing what? Interceding on behalf of foreign nations to see them saved. Right at the beginning. Here he is. And he's appealing to God's justice. Abraham answered, verse 27, and said, behold, I've undertaken to speak... verse 26. And the Lord said, if I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Abraham answered and said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. And again he spoke to him and said, suppose 40 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 40 I will not do it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. He said, behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. He answered, for the sake of 20 I will not destroy it. Then he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. Now, I don't know if Abraham is appealing to God's justice because he recognizes that there's not likely to be 50, right? Well, maybe not even 45 or 40. I don't know. But the idea here seems to be that he's asking the question, if there's just a few, will you spare them? Will you save them? He answered, for the sake of 10 I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way, and when he had finished speaking to Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place. So the Lord righteously agrees, justly agrees, to save any righteous persons. Okay? And it seems that Lot, not even his wife, right, is the only righteous person as we go into the story. And he's the only righteous person who's believing in Abraham's God. You guys follow? Okay? Saves no other. The question is there an allusion to Isaiah 53 here? Now, why do I say that? Now, I mean, in other words, when I understand that there wouldn't be an allusion going forward, okay? But the question is, when Isaiah 53 is written, is there an allusion back to this portion of Genesis? And I ask that because Isaiah 53 is this passage in which we have Isaiah giving promises about the restoration of Israel. And he says, Israel, you'll be restored. They're in exile. You're going to be restored. And when you're restored, you're going to be my servant. Right? And you're going to be my servant. I'm going to pour out my spirit upon you. You're going to be my servant. You're going to be my witness to the nations. You're going to be, if you guys follow Isaiah 32, all the way, really is very clear about this, all the way through multiple other passages in Isaiah, but if you really to the end of Isaiah. But here you've got this passage where Isaiah 53 comes in, And Israel is the servant. And what's Israel the servant doing on behalf of the people? In Isaiah 53. The servant Israel is doing what?
Making many to be counted righteous.
Yeah. So Josh pointed exactly at the right text. Look there at Isaiah 53 and verse 10. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. That's speaking of the Christ. Really, here is Israel, his servant, who is the Messiah. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore I will divide with him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many and makes intercession for the transgressors. In other words, this suffering servant Israel will be the one who makes intercession for the wicked, and who takes the sin of the wicked upon himself. Now we know Isaiah 53 gets then applied to who?
Christ.
Jesus, right? The Messiah. Okay? But understand in the context, Isaiah 52, 53 is talking about Israel as a nation. And it's applied to Jesus. And I'm saying, if we come back to Abraham, what's Abraham doing?
Interceding.
He's interceding on the behalf of wicked nations, wanting their salvation. This is a story, folks, all the way through. All right. In Genesis 19, 1 through 29, the Lord saves Lot's family, the righteous, and really destroys Sodom, the wicked. Now, I'm not going to read all of Genesis 19, 1 through 29. You guys are familiar with the story. It demonstrates the wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah, doesn't it? What? Somebody give me a quick summary. What happens in this part of the story? The couple of angels, these men, go to Sodom and Gomorrah where Lot is, and what happens?
Said they want to know the men.
What's that?
The people of the city, the men of the city wanted to.
Yeah, the men in the city want to have sex with them.
Yeah.
Okay, these angelic guests. The question is this potentially, depending on some scholars, a repeat of what we see in Genesis 6? Some scholars arguing that in Genesis 6 we're seeing man reach the level of wickedness at which he now has sex with angels or demons, right? And so the question is this man reaching that level of wickedness again? There's speculation, so it's very speculative, so I want to be careful. But this is where guys start getting into this. The point is, however you see it, these angels have come in to town essentially as guests of Lot's house, and what do the men of the city want to do? Greet them and give them dinner? No, right? They want to brutally rape them. Okay? They want to commit homosexual acts with them. All right? The Lord saves Lot's family and then destroys the city. Right? Okay. His wife looks back, and what happens to her? What's that?
Pillar of salt.
She turns a pillar of salt. Okay. So it's she's looking back, really wanting, like, that's home, and that's it for her. All right. So this is a pretty devastating scene, but Lot and his family, his kids get out. Right, his daughters. Now I want to see. I've skipped the first 29 verses and jumped down to where the seed of the serpent, who will oppose the seed of Abraham, really grows or comes to the sin of Lot and his daughters. Look at verse 30. Go down there to verse 30. Then he said, verse 30 of chapter 19. Now Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his two daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his two daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, our father's old, and there's not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring for our father. By the way, do you remember someone who was saved through massive judgment before, who wine drinking led to devastation? Noah. Right? Noah. Massive judgment happens. Noah and his family are saved, and Noah turns to the bottle, right? And gets drunk off the fruit of the vine, and a lot of stuff happens as a result. Here again, verse 32, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve our offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in and lay with her father. He did not know where she lay down, or when she arose. The next day the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let us make him drink wine tonight also. Then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. So they made their father drink wine that night also. And the younger arose and lay with him, and he did not know when she lay down and when she arose. Listen, Lot is not altogether innocent here, folks. I mean, he's letting himself get liquored up night after night. Okay? And then falling into this sexual sin. Verse 36, thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. Now the question is, why are we told this story? Right? What's that?
Ammonites and Moabites.
Yeah, look at the next phrase in verse 37. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Why does that matter? What's that? Yeah, these are people who represent the seed of the serpent, who are at enmity with the seed of the woman, the seed of Abraham. Right? The Moabites and the Ammonites become the enemies on an ongoing basis. Remember, we go back to Genesis 3:15. What's the original curse on the serpent? I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. Right? Those are collective. So here the enmity is happening. And so in the story of Genesis, you're not only seeing the coming of the seed of the woman, but you're also seeing, really, again, the story of the seed of the serpent, aren't you? Who opposes the seed of the woman. Right? And then eventually, obviously, Jesus being the ultimate seed of the woman, crushing Satan, the ultimate seed of the serpent. All right, so Genesis 20, God blesses Abraham with more land and wealth for his kingdom in spite of his lapse of faith again. Okay? Now, I'm not going to read through Genesis 20 because I want to get to Genesis 21 so we can wrap there, Genesis 21 and 22. But God is blessing him, more land and wealth, in spite of his faithlessness. What do we see repeated in the story in Genesis 20 that we've seen before in Abraham's life? He wants to give his wife away again. Okay? Now, she's no spring chicken at this point. Right? Okay? But he's still got serious fear issues, right? And so he's like, you can have her. Just don't mess with me. All right? Happens again. This is the second time this happens in his life, by the way. And in spite of it, in other words, when he gives his wife away, what's then threatened? Guys, because this is important to the story. What's then threatened every time he gives his wife away like this? The seed. Right? But God protects the seed. He protects Sarah and protects the seed. And then Abraham gets even more wealth. And Genesis 20 concludes, really, with Abraham again acting in a priestly manner as he intercedes on behalf of Abimelech. Right? He intercedes on his behalf that he'd be healed. And he is. All right, so then we get to chapter 21. So you guys are seeing how the story is just continuing to fall out very clearly on these tracks. So we get to Genesis 21. Isaac, the son of Abraham, and Sarah is born. Now I want you to notice as we look here, there's this very intentional narrative repetition that Abraham is having this son through Sarah. This only son. Which presses us forward to Genesis 22. Because in Genesis 22, you have this repetition of this son that Abraham is supposed to sacrifice, right? So, very, very clear. And you also get the laughter of Sarah as it really becomes the laughter of recognition that God keeps his promises. It's had the last laugh, right? So let's look there, Genesis 21, 1 through 7. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah had bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son when he was 8 days old, or son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. You guys notice the repetitive way in which it's emphasizing this son who's born through Sarah? And now really Sarah's laughing again, but her laughter is really a trust. Like she's laughing as if like, the Lord, I recognize the Lord's kept his promises and I was a fool, right? Not to believe him. And so this son has come. But notice again, I tell you guys, the tension of the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman grows again. The tension of these two between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman grows again. And then as a result, Abraham disinherits Ishmael. Look at verse 8. And the child grew and was weaned. And Abraham made a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Now here's the laughter again. Who's laughing this time? What's that? Hagar. Okay? Oh, no, sorry, not Hagar. The son of Hagar. Ishmael's laughing. Ishmael's laughing. He's an adult at this point. Isaac is somewhere, a child, somewhere between a little child and a teen. Okay, so here he is. And Ishmael's laughing. What's he laughing at? What's happening on this day? Abraham made a great feast on the day when Isaac was weaned, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. What's happening on this day?
It's not circumcision.
No, circumcision isn't happening. He's already circumcised. What's that? Yeah, they're done with nursing him, and now they're having this great feast, recognizing in some way what about him? What are they recognizing about Isaac?
Journey to manhood.
Yeah, he's becoming the heir. He's becoming the heir. And what's Ishmael doing about that?
Not happy.
He's mocking it.
He's mocking because he's the firstborn.
Yeah, I'm the firstborn. You having a big feast for him? He's mocking this idea that Isaac is going to be the heir. He's laughing at it. Again, this laughter gets picked up. We're actually told that he's persecuting Isaac. That he's mocking him and persecuting. You're not the heir. So she said to Abraham, this is Sarah, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. That's how we know he's mocking his being the heir. And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, now listen, it's interesting what God says to him. Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. Now, what's he telling Abraham here? What's the Lord telling him?
Wife's right.
Your wife's right. Listen to your wife. Cast him out. And then we read about him being casted out. He's disinherited. So Abraham rose early in the morning, verse 14, and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. And you hear some of her story here, but he disinherits her. And he disinherits Ishmael. You're disinherited. You're not going to be an heir. Who's going to be the heir? Isaac. God has confirmed, listen to the voice of your wife on this. Now, how do we know that this is persecution from really an adult Ishmael at this point, okay, against Isaac? Go to Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4. Thank you, Josh. Chapter 4, and look at verse 28 to start there. Now you, brothers, who's he talking to? Gentile believers in Christ. You, brothers, like Isaac, are children of the promise. Now, why is he saying that? Because what were the Judaizers saying about the Gentile believers in Christ? Yeah, unless you're circumcised, unless you become one of us, you're not children of the promise. Right? You're not. And he says, you brothers, like Isaac, are children of the promise. Now notice, but just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh, that being Ishmael, persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, in other words, miraculously, born according to the flesh versus according to the Spirit is talking about what? Natural birth versus supernatural birth here. Okay, remember the story. So also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. In other words, we're children of Sarah, not Hagar. Remember, Hagar and her slave son, Ishmael, were to be cast out because what were they doing? Persecuting. Verse 29. But just at that time, he was born according to the flesh, persecuted. Ishmael persecuted Isaac and was born according to the Spirit. So now the Judaizers are persecuting you Christians. Right? You Gentile Christians. And so he drives back to this. And he's saying, cast out the slave woman and his son. By the way, what is he saying then about the Judaizers?
They're not the seed. They're Ishmael.
They're Ishmael.
Yeah.
They're not the heirs. Why? Why are the Judaizers not the heirs in Galatians? These are people saying they're Christians. What's that?
They're putting their faith in their own flesh and their own lineage.
Yeah, they're putting their faith in their own flesh. They've added to justification by faith alone. Go read Galatians. They've added to it. They've added something to it. And what are they told when they've added to justification by faith alone? What does Paul say about them adding to the gospel in Galatians 1? What's his word for them? Let them be what? Accursed or anathema. Condemned to hell. Right? Even an angel of heaven, even if I preach to you a different gospel, let me be accursed. Okay? This becomes very important because what we need to understand here is that essentially Ishmael is believing a different gospel, isn't he? He's believing a different gospel. So is Hagar. And to some degree, so is Abraham. He has to be corrected by his wife. God made a promise to us through Isaac, not through Ishmael. And we're going to keep his promise not through the flesh, but by the Spirit. Right? He made this promise. He's the one who's going to save. He's the one who's going to bless through our son, Isaac. And you see these two seeds. See the serpent against the seed of the woman again. All right. And then you have from here the story a bit of Ishmael. You have a bit of the story of Ishmael with his mom, and then a treaty that's made with Abimelech. And then we come to Genesis 22, which I am not going to get to today. So, Genesis 22 we'll come back to. It's what happens then with Isaac. Right? What happens then with Isaac? Because there's this climactic point, if you will. If Isaac is the son, who is the heir, then why does God tell him to go sacrifice him? That's what comes up in Genesis 22. All right, which becomes an incredibly important scene that we'll get to next week. You guys have questions?
I have a quick question.
Yes, sir.
Nothing super important, but it seems like in Genesis 21 that Ishmael's a child at that point.
It seems that way, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, but he's not.
for sure.
Yeah, for sure. He's 13 in Genesis 17, right? So he's going to be at least 14 or 15 at this point.
Yeah.
So he's going to be in his mid-teens somewhere. So, I mean, that wouldn't have been a child in that culture. I mean, he could be referred to as a child in one way. But, I mean, men married older than women. Women in that culture might have married at 13, 14, 15. Men tended to be maybe in their upper teens or early 20s. So it's, maybe he could be referenced as a child that way. But he would be a pubescent child, right? I mean, he would be as probably as, he wouldn't be as big as David over here or Bryce, right? Because they would be huge men in that culture. Huge.
Maybe just emphasizing that he's son of
Yeah.
Hagar.
It's an emphasis that he's...
Of his age.
Exactly. Yeah, you guys know how big Jesus probably was, speculation is? First century Jewish man.
5'2".
Yeah, at best he was probably 5'5", 5'6", That would have been a pretty decent sized man that century. Yeah. Smaller people in general. We've gotten bigger.
I was born a long time.
Yeah. You'd have been towering figure in the first century. Yeah. Just remember that. If you're not real big, at one point in history, I would have been the man. All right. So you just don't live in that century. Sorry. All right. Jason would have been really hip in the 17th century if you know him. So there's a century for everybody. All right. Any other questions? Doesn't happen any this morning, huh? Is it the room? Just cold and stale? It's made you less excited? It'll be warmer in about 3 to 4 weeks. Really nice in here, actually, once it's all done. So anyway, nothing else? Yes, sir.
I have an observation. It's interesting that God preserves Lot. Lot is of the seed of the serpent, right? I mean, from him come the Moabites and Ammonites. Is Lot himself, a righteous man, or is how does? I'm just trying to think about how that works.
Yeah.
Evidenced by his actions, it's as if the two men arrive they're going to determine, they make a big point. No, we're going to spend the night in the square. And it's like the only person, Lot, is there saying, oh, no, you're going to stay in my house.
Yep.
And he insists there. So there is a sense that
He'll protect them even at the expense of his own daughters, if you remember the story.
Yeah. It shows the links. So it's hard to say just upon circumstances whether or not he was unrighteous. He appears in the story.
And in some sense,
that in the whole city, there was only one righteous person. And you look at the actions of his wife and his daughters, they went because he was going, but they had to be kind of carried away.
Well, in the case of his daughters, it's interesting too. They always covenant with families, right? God always covenants with families. So Noah gets to take his family, right? Lot gets to take his family. That's the pattern. Even though the family isn't always faithful. Abraham's covenant with Abraham, but his family. That's a normal pattern. So, all right. Any other questions? Anybody else? So next week then we'll be in Genesis 22 and hopefully get through 22 23, 24, maybe to the story of Joseph. That's what I'm hoping for. Is to get through that and through Jacob. Through Isaac. And Jacob really, is the story of Isaac is really the story of Jacob largely. You hear a little bit about Isaac, right? And then you launch into really the story of his son Jacob. And then the story of Jacob launches into his story of his son who? Joseph. Right? And so we'll get that emphasis. But we'll see if I can get through Isaac / Jacob next week. We'll see. I'm not going to make too many promises, but that's the goal. All right. So let me pray.